Okay, I think we are live. Hi, my name is Jakub, and welcome to another edition of Zaiste Interviews. So Zaiste Interviews is a series of interviews about programming. The goal is to bring on people from diverse backgrounds to talk, to informally chat about programming and everything around it. Today, I'm thrilled to have Ryan Carniato on the show. Ryan is the creator of Solid.js, a fast, declarative and compiled JavaScript library for creating user interfaces. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you.
So I've been looking to this conversation because Solid.js is not only a great library, but it also embodies something which I really like about programming, which is this constant innovation, this drive to make things better. And the space for UI libraries is pretty crowded, but Solid.js has a lot of interesting ideas that make it unique and worth looking into. So I hope in this interview we will have a chance to talk about as many of these ideas as possible. But before we start, I know you are a musician, and I wanted to ask you, what instruments do you play, and what type of music?
Yeah, I started playing music when I was pretty young, but like I was like in school band and I played saxophone. Though I'm sure what you actually referring to is I played guitar in a punk rock band for quite a number of years. I put the band together, me and two other guys, when we were like 11, and I played music all the way through, trying to promote that band all the way till I was about 25.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was definitely a journey, and I like sometimes talking about it because actually it kind of ties into where I even got the name Solid from. It wasn't from like some programming, background or something. The band was actually called Mr. Solid and later Solid, and we got the name from chocolate Easter bunnies. We were sitting around like doing that really lame thing when you're like, what do you name the band? And you're looking around and you're like putting adjectives together with like things you see around the house,
So
brown, silver chair, whatever, kind of thing. And some family of the friend of the family had basically was sitting there and was like saw the Easter bunny box and was like, what about Mr. Solid, right? And it was kind of a cheeky name, right? Being a pop punk band, we ultimately went for it, even though I wasn't a big fan initially. But what it meant actually over time is I just became known as Ryan Solid. That was just kind of my moniker. And years later, sitting there trying to like figure out what to call this library of mine, I again had no ideas, and kind of ended up there,
with Solid.
Yeah.
And what was your transition to programming? How
I was always about both things. It was kind of funny. My father went back to school. He was actually like in construction work, and he went back to learn programming around when I was about 10. And he introduced me to Quick Basic. He was like, Brian, come here. I made a game. And it was like, it wasn't a game. It was like an arrow going up the screen over and over and over again. And, he was so, proud of the fact that he'd animated this thing. He was using, I don't know, he wasn't even using off-screen buffer. You could like visually see the screen flicker. And I understood immediately what he'd done, right? I'd played video games and I was like, oh, like this isn't just like a drawing, like he actually made the computer do this. And I was like instantly enthralled. I wanted to learn as much as I could. So I was trying to make my own video games in Quick Basic, within a few months, I feel like I probably surpassed where his Quick Basic knowledge had gone. And it was difficult at that time because there wasn't really like much source to look at. You basically look at the example code, gorillas or whatever that came with it. Luckily, a couple years later, my uncle, who had been in university, he gave me some of his programming books, and that's sort of how I got further along on it. But yeah, I was 11 when I started programming, and I was 11, 12-ish when I started the band. Both things were my focus, and they actually came into conflict.
I ask about it because there's a lot of great programmers who are musicians at the same time, and there seems to be like a relation between music and programming. There is like this aspect of music. It's somehow mathematical, and there is this focus.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's a lot of creativity when it comes to writing programming. Like nothing's fixed. Even design patterns and stuff. The way you want to model something, you're always kind of going in and trying to like think about how to represent that problem. And I'm not sure exactly the relationship, obviously, but I could see how the same kind of process is there. Even in things that seem like really manual, like debugging. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's actually a creative process to actually picture the scenario in which the bug could happen. And so I do see those ties, definitely.
And there's also this aspect of repetition. We have to run those programs over and over again, the same way as we have to, practice a piece or something.
That's interesting. Like, do we have muscle memory for that kind of stuff as well? I'm not sure. That's interesting.
So you mentioned BASIC, right, at the beginning, and then what other programming languages did you use?
Yeah, so it was quick BASIC, like then actually C++. I wanted to make video games, so I learned DirectX, right, and then with C++ mostly, and then moved on eventually, like towards my late teens. I was doing stuff in C# and .NET. Which I actually really liked C# at that time. But the kind of funny thing is I had two different paths. Like my interest in video games had me going that way, but on the other hand, I'm revealing my age a little bit here. It was also kind of the dawn of the internet, and people were getting into it. So I was, technically speaking, probably C+ predates my HTML and JavaScript, but it's very, very close. Like basically, local businesses were looking for websites. I was in a band. I needed a website, so I was building that, and that was like babysitting money kind of deal, like, or paper money. Like I'd be making, doing small jobs like that all through my teens, and that's sort of was my introduction to like web programming, because I was like, it was very much Vue source back then, and maybe a Perl script to do a guest book or something. It was very different than where it became. But luckily, I guess, I don't even know, I was into C# because of the Microsoft background, just kind of continuing on this way. A teacher had given me a copy of Visual Studio C++ 97, Visual Studios 97, for like helping him redo all the computers one summer. And that's put me on this kind of Microsoft path for a while. And it came back around later, because my first job that I actually got ended up being doing web programming with C#. Even though I was like game, I was able to kind of pull it around. And it was a very different experience to the web programming I did when I was younger, because like everything was server side, JavaScript, like it was that early 2000s time period.
So it was like JSP for Java and ASP for .NET,
exactly, right? Exactly. Yeah. Don't get me started about that horror show of ASP.NET web forms. I mean, ASP's got better over time, but like that was just, I call it the dark ages sometimes.
So have you continued with web programming, or games were still on your radar?
Yeah. Well, the thing was, I talked about the music a bit. It was actually a bit of a conflict for me, because what had happened was I dropped out of university to pursue the music career. So this kind of made it difficult that when the music stuff wasn't like going anywhere. I mean, we thought we were going to do good. I don't know if you heard that 80s band, Loverboy. Mike Reno was like producing our album. They were supposed to get like another album they were going to put out, and then we were going to be on a subsidiary minor label underneath that, under the major. Like we thought we were going places, but when that didn't really pan out, I started looking for jobs, because I was kind of tired of working in the record store. I worked at HMV selling CDs and records in a time when CDs were dying out. It was actually hard to get that programming job with people were like, well, what's your experience? And I was actually just like, please hire me. I work hard, I learn, and I would show them my game demos. I'd be like, look, this is like how to do like a water effect with a assembly. Like So eventually someone hired me in a QA position. Like I'm talking about, they weren't even like, it was a co-op position. And I sort of fought my way through that to end up leading the QA team, and then eventually to be a junior developer there. And through that, actually was able to make the go back to school, because I was like, look, I've shown that I have interest here. Take me back into university.
Yes, okay.
And then I finished my degree. But it was quite a long journey, and not being able to decide between the music and the programming. And one side was like kind of bad in that I never really got to really give my all to either. But on the other side, I had amazing experiences touring with the band, doing that whole thing. And it influenced who I am today even greater,
So your first job as junior programmer, was it about web development or?
Yeah, it was web development. Yeah, it's funny. I was showing them these game demos, and they were just like, "Oh, the guy knows C# and he seems diligent and whatnot." So they brought me on as just doing some testing, which we were doing. I think like Ruby scripts and Water, and then the app was written actually it was written in Visual Basic. Now that I think about it, it was written in Visual Basic. So
interesting.
So I got my start in ASP.NET web forms in Visual Basic. But it was a great job in that they kind of brought me up. And by the end of that time period, the teams are kind of readjusting, and the company was growing. And I was kind of back at university. They were really supportive in that. But they also kind of put me on this almost like remote team kind of scenario. But one side that kind of isolated me from the rest of the team while I was also doing university. So I'd come into the office and I wasn't really connecting with people. But on the positive side, it put me in a different space, because I was working with all these acquisitions that had these really slow, bloated projects that weren't using like the internal framework that the active network that I was working for was using. And they wanted just quick solutions to speed up and modernize these apps. And what that usually meant actually was stripping all the logic out of the ASP.NET and putting a layer of JavaScript on top of it. And that meant that suddenly, we had all these .NET programmers that didn't want to touch JavaScript. And I was like, I have no problem. I'll touch JavaScript. I like JavaScript. So I learned Knockout.js, or I first learned jQuery, and then it was Knockout.js and Ember by the end of it. So I was doing like a JavaScript program on top of server rendered ASP pages. And that really got me back into JavaScript. And most importantly, introduced me to Knockout.js, which was probably one of my first love of JavaScript frameworks.
Interesting. And so you stayed with Knockout.js, and was there any like connection with React later on down the road?
Yeah, I guess going through the whole story here, after I left that company, I was finishing up my degree. I ended up starting for a startup about 2012 time period, and they were full stack Node, all JavaScript. And I was like, oh, wow, that's amazing. And the guy who was hiring, who was in charge, he wrote Knockback, which was a library for Backbone and Knockout. And it kind of tied it together into like a full framework. So it was like Backbone models with reactive views. And because I was pretty proficient with Knockout, pretty good at hacking around stuff, I managed to make a good impression. And I got in there, and that was an amazing experience, because that team was very open source centric. And we stayed on Knockout. I mean, technically to now, the Knockout app is still in production. It's just going to be released in 2020. I'm no longer, developer on that team, but we've supported a production Knockout app for 8 years. And but it was kind of like our own framework built on it. And we wrote our own ORM, which again, why the hell do that? But GraphQL didn't exist. So we had to solve the same problem. And it basically, I was maintaining these kind of open source projects that were for the startup, which I don't think is always the best thing to do in hindsight. But on the other hand, it was an incredible experience and learning opportunity for me. And I learned a lot from Kevin, who as I said, ran that team until he moved on. And then from there, I kind of it was a startup. So I ended up kind of moving on to being like in charge of that team. And I led it for from 2015 to 2020 for about 5 years. So amazing experience working with startups, working with Knockout specifically. I got to train people. I got to see every like in and out and problem people have doing reactive programming for almost a decade.
So when I read your articles about Solid, and we will get into that, and about programming in general, about front end, you refer a lot. I mean, you go back a lot to Knockout.js, and it seems like Knockout.js was like this kind of like early idea for what we have now.
Yeah,
Do you agree with that?
I can't impress how. I mean, it's always happening. We recycle stuff; it comes back around. Like when we stepped into that scenario, when I stepped into that startup, I felt like I was developing in the future. I mean, we were using CoffeeScript, which now people would kind of laugh at, but that meant like, kind of arrow functions, modern Lambda developer experience. We're using Knockout, which is based on primitives. So if you haven't seen it, it looks like the view composition API, but it came out in 2010. Basically, I posted something on Twitter a little while ago. Like I was like, this is 2020, this is 2010. Tell me the difference. There are differences. There's huge differences, but a lot of those like concepts existed then, and it was amazing. It felt powerful, and I never really got over that feeling. To be fair, I just over time the Knockout itself was updated less, and it was kind of became more dated. But it was kind of incredible the work that was being done at Microsoft towards the end of the 2000s. They kind of both pioneered like Knockout. Like I think the guy Steve Sanderson worked for the Razor team, and this was like their way of doing more interactive JavaScript views on the edge. But then on the Rx.js and that whole thing, the Rx ReactiveX also came out of Microsoft from around that time as well. ReactiveX, Reactive, RxNet, RxJava, and eventually Rx.js. So like really interesting ideas and kind of really cool time to be exploring with stuff. JavaScript felt new again because of all the stuff that was happening around that time. Frameworks are just starting up. This is all pre-React. Then React came around and just killed everything. I mean, it is good. And it finally brought order to things, but it was kind of funny, the effect. React had such a huge effect on everything else that like things were never the same. And almost every project I liked just died off with the advent of React. And I was like, I think there's more here. We should look into it. And that's sort of what fueled a lot of the stuff with Solid. It got harder and harder to hire new hires and stuff on Knockout, even though there was like a lot of advantages, I thought, to the approach and a lot of power.
That's what I wanted to ask, because you mentioned Knockout, React.js, and when was the moment when you started thinking about creating something, like alternative to React.js? Was it, when React was already like catching on, or?
Yeah, so I'd say about 2014, 2015. I built a web component framework. Kevin from my work was React came out with components, and we wanted to kind of break apart our MVVM models in something more reusable. And he was like, well, let's look at components. So he did a prototype, and I was like, okay, yeah, no, I think we can take this further. And I had a whole idea, and he let me kind of run with it. And I kind of came up with a web component framework around Knockout, and I was like, look, we don't need React. We have all the pieces we need to do the exact same model. We even set up backbone models as Flux stores, and we basically modeled that whole thing. Problem was, Knockout isn't perfect, and it just kind of became clear, especially with the traps people were hitting, that things just weren't, going to be like nice enough in certain ways. Like in some ways better than React, some ways worse, kind of trade-offs. But like MobX around 2015, kind of really showed that you could do reactive in a really sane way. And around that time, I was like, okay, well, what can I do with this Knockout model? I started playing there. But honestly, React has such an impact on the direction of front end development that, I said React taketh, but React also giveth, so to speak, because by 2015, almost all the reactive libraries were just dead, like just completely dead in the water. If you like, Knockout, what else was there? Like Reactive and CanJS, and there's a whole bunch of them. They all just died because there wasn't the interest in the model. There's problems with the update model. It was like too like ping pong. You could never keep hold of it. But it also was that people are just like, look, simple JavaScript always re-renders, forget about it, out of sight, out of mind. And I was like, okay, well, that's a tough challenge. I'm going to have to figure out how to build a framework that keeps that. And I was kind of on that path. But then, I got like 90, 80% of the way there, and I was like kind of happy. But the problem with the reactive system is you always need the primitives. There's always the computed. There's always like that thing. And I was like, people are never going to like this. And then React was like, here, React hooks. I was like jaw drop. I was just like, is this possible that React has just told everyone that they should use a paradigm that looks identical to what I've been trying to build?
Interesting. So when I first stumbled upon Solid.js, I had this impression that it's very complete, because React.js for me was like this attempt to solve problems, and it's like a journey. They started with something and they were changing it along the way. And you have this somehow privilege to look back and fix what they did wrong somehow. And when I first encountered it, I've seen that you have like the everything is built in. And I was wondering, how would you like to move it forward? Would you like to have it like a more complete library, or like all in one, or do you envision it somehow
I
more in pieces?
always liked the lightweight thing. I know React was like, we're just the view and view model or whatever. And I was kind of like, yeah, more like you're like the view, or sorry, the view and MVC, sorry. But I was like, the components are really like the view and the view model kind of thing. But to me, again, Knockout 4 years earlier, or 3 years earlier, already had kind of established that space. That was the beautiful thing about reactivity. It's very transferable, right? You don't need the model, sub it in. Even rendering to a certain degree, sub it in. Like, so when I've always liked the minimalist thing. The truth of the matter is, I started there. I was like, okay, people will use web components. I will focus on the reactivity as one module, and then I'll focus on the rendering as like another thing. And actually, the way Solid's built right now is actually, there's a separate DOM expressions library that can basically be compiled to create any reactive framework using that renderer. I wanted to keep all these things separate towards this like use the platform thing. Over time, I mean, and it's kind of obvious in hindsight, I realized that the connectivity between these elements actually is where a lot of the room for optimization and orchestration and real power lies. So I, kind of moved off web components. I still have support for them, obviously, but like they stopped being my primary goal. And, things have gone like a little bit more involved, because I really honestly wanted the reactive system to just be its own thing. But if you look at Solid now, its reactive system is, well, it's not tied to the renderer. It's also built in such a way that you would only really use it if you were trying to do hierarchical reactive graphs like you'd find in a view tree. Like, it's just based in a way that is kind of set up to solve those kind of problems, and maybe not the general problems. Like, you're forced to create everything in a reactive route. This always confuses new people, because they're like, well, what if I just want to make some reactive thing over here? And I'm like, no, you got to kind of jump around it. It's because I really wanted it to make it streamline the way disposal and garbage collection worked. And that required kind of wrapping everything in a certain way that isn't perhaps intuitive from just like, I'm just going to go play with reactivity standpoint. Like, it's definitely framework oriented, even if it isn't tied necessarily to the rendering technique. So I know, a bit of a long answer to your question, but what I was trying to get at is that I do like keeping things minimal if possible, but I think it's inevitable, the way things are heading, that things get more involved. We've seen it with SvelteKit. We've seen it with other stuff. Just biggest part is server-side rendering adds a level of complexity that is impossible to do without orchestration. And you even see React itself kind of backing off. It's like, I'm just a library view. Like, it's pretty hard these days to kind of treat React like it's just a library.
But you also decided to go with the compilation. So it's somehow similar to Svelte, right? And radically different than React.js. You don't need the engine, right? And you can just focus on what's needed and the output. And
if I can clarify a bit here, I think this is where some of the confusion comes in a little bit around here. It is custom compiled. Like, I do actually, the JSX actually goes through quite a different compilation than React. It's not just hyperscript. It's not just like, you're not just looking at a bunch of functions as they lay. but Solid's approach is actually purely runtime. So like the actual reactive system is a runtime reactive system, not a compile time reactive system.
Okay.
So technically speaking, there's a hyperscript version. If you want to like lose a little of the optimization, there's a tag template literal version. As of right now, I think Solid's tag template literal version is actually the most performant tag template literal implementation in a framework today, even though that's like kind of like a side thing. It's not really what my goal is. But it's a runtime approach. The only thing the compiler does is optimize the JSX, and that's because and it's not even the components so much. Although there is the way Solid approaches components is kind of unique. Maybe talk about that later. But it's that I optimize the DOM operations, right? That was the key part. By statically analyzing the whole, tree of where the bindings fall and where the like how the elements are structured, I can optimize how I create the DOM elements. And that's something that with like VDOM libraries, you don't do, because you just can constantly run all these functions. Each element is a separate kind of node. Whereas I can just go, and I think Vue has a similar concept, except they then feed it into a VDOM anyways, but you can kind of statically hoist all the static parts, and this reduces the code, and that's beneficial both for execution and for even just code size. So kind of like Svelte, but also kind of like React. Like it's actually a runtime strategy just with an optimizing compiler.
So do you think that's the best approach we could take? I mean, how would you? Because Svelte recently is becoming really popular. It's like there's a lot of buzz around Svelte, and there is also.
I mean, it depends. I like it because I like control. If you've noticed so far, I like the ability to kind of say exactly what I want. And don't get me wrong, like with Svelte, people talk about, people complain about like with the template language, like, oh, it's not flexible, Turing complete. You can do pretty much anything you want in those frameworks, like Vue, Svelte. Like people give, like the negative put there is kind of, garbage, in the same way that when people say, oh, you can't analyze JSX, also garbage. Like they're kind of all the same thing, but there is limitations of when you pull it into the language. You lose to keep it slick, and especially if it's pulling into the JavaScript language and you want to keep that syntax, you lose the ability to express certain details easily without introducing other APIs, which is fine. You can introduce the other APIs, but you kind of also don't want to, because it function helpers when
Ryan, I think we lost you. Could you repeat the last phrase?
Yeah, when I was saying the limits of the language. I was saying that the problem is that not that you can't do stuff by introducing helpers. It's just it hacks the elegance of how you design the language, because you don't really want to pull in these functions to aid the language in doing its thing. So that kind of puts limits generally on the design space of like what you're going to do with the language. I do have experience with this because of my other work that I do, which is also kind of like compiles a language with Marco. But Solid just gives me this ultimate control over what updates, how it updates. I guess it's more something that appeals to like a senior dev or something. I like that control, like a lot.
And if you could compare it with other approaches, because the space is pretty crowded on the front end, and there is a lot of interesting libraries that were created after React.js that were also focused on speed, for example, or being small, or being compiled.
Yeah.
And how do you view them?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because like there's just so many trade-offs you can make. So you just kind of try to find and carve out your own space.
Exactly. Yeah.
And like when we're talking here about comparisons, it's interesting because in some ways, I say Solid's like React because I believe in their philosophy. I like their whole unidirectional flow, even though that's something not people usually don't value with reactive libraries, because reactive libraries make it easy. I don't care about the easiness necessarily. I mean, it's important to be able to have nice understandable update model, but I like the philosophy behind React. In another way, you can say Solid's like Vue, because the composition API and Solid's API are like the same thing. We're talking fine-grained reactivity that's built into the framework in a way that's really natural. So, there's a lot of similarities there. But Vue also decided that it like made the opposite trade-offs, like where I was like all about React's philosophy, not about its technology. Vue was like all about the easy reactive philosophy, but use React's technology. So like there's obviously differences, but they feed into a VDOM, and like they just have kind of like, there's similarities and differences. Svelte, on the other hand, like Solid, has no VDOM, very performant, but it's like the opposite extent of like of the Vue, where it's like everything is just this easy kind of kind of progressive framework, I call it, basically, where the introduction is really easy, but then you learn how complex it is after the fact. So the one thing I love about React is what they give you at the beginning is what you have at the end. It never changes. Like you don't have, like once you got a couple APIs, that's how it will always work. When you dig into Vue or Svelte, you will always unravel new things and details because they purposely hide it from you at the beginning. And
I see.
So a lot of ways, Solid's like a lot of those other frameworks. And in that respect, I can see people being like, I got the chance to learn from all of them and then come up with what I consider the perfect solution. The thing is, I was working on it alongside. I've been working on this since, as I said, 2015, 2016 time period. So I kind of had a vision direction right from that time period. I could see this stuff happening. I mean, I was thinking someone would probably step in and do this before me. It would just seem like the obvious thing to do. But over time, I understand why the other frameworks probably won't. So
when talking about Solid.js, is it more like what you get? I mean, it's open in the sense that the API you get is the API you will use, or is it more like something you will discover once you get deeper with Solid.js?
I'm hoping that's the API you get is the API you use. I mean, there are some special primitives, just like in React, you go down, there's the advanced primitives, but you could basically have a primitives cheat sheet. And that's the single experience, right? Like you just have the JS files, you have the JSX, you have the primitives. That's it. There's not like, like stores aren't a different technology. Stores are the same primitives, Svelte has this kind of level up where you go from like the $ operator to like, oh, now I want to abstract, I have stores. Same thing with like the different APIs that you can use Vue. You can use Vue there's a whole bunch of different APIs. I think composition API has streamlined it, and I think that is the solution. And I think Vue does a really good job there. But I'm talking like historically, it's just kind of where you value easiness versus simpleness. They're slightly different concepts. So I feel like on that side, Solid aligns more with React.
I see. So you mentioned no virtual DOM, and could we focus on that? Because when I posted something on Solid.js, there was a lot of confusion for people who are new to frontend, and they believe that there is this like myth, maybe we could say, that if you have virtual DOM, it will be faster. And there is this like famous article already by Rich Harris that talks about this phenomena. And I wanted to ask you if you could maybe clarify that, and why did you decide to not use virtual DOM?
Yeah, I mean, you don't need a virtual DOM because you don't need to do diffing if you're doing granular reactive updates. So like Knockout.js did not have a virtual DOM. Knockout.js had a lot of problems, but it did not have a virtual DOM. It had the fastest updates. The problem, of course, was creation. It's, so like right back, if you go back to 2012, 2013 or whatever, like the time React was being developed and came out, they came out and they're like, look, we are faster than dirty checking. Look at our amazing performance with the virtual DOM. But the reality was Knockout was still faster than it, considerably faster, because when you consider that, like React 16 was a big performance improvement, but if you go back to those early like React 0.13 or whatever, like you go back to those old ones, the performance was like comparable or better than Angular, but it wasn't like reactive libraries would kill it on any kind of update test. But, you know, the whole point wasn't the performance. It was like, you don't have to think about how these things updates. It just works. So, but there was kind of this tirade for a while with the VDOM where people were doing these benchmarks that were literally data diffs. Like I've never developed an app like that. Maybe I just developed in the wrong apps. Maybe I worked in kind of like social media, photo sharing, that kind of stuff. I didn't do stock tickers where I redrew the whole page every second. Like that's what the benchmarks were. And I think they're ridiculous. But those benchmarks favor virtual DOM libraries, and part of the death of reactive libraries at the time. To this date, reactive libraries do not do amazing in those stock ticker benchmarks. They're not good. I mean, I did come up with a solution, which is why one of the things I knew I needed to prove stuff with Solid. But generally speaking, when you're doing user type interaction, there's only two things going on. If there's the little updates, which are super fast in reactive libraries, and then there's the navigations where you have to create. So I've realized if we can solve the creation performance issue, which usually is bigger on reactive libraries because they have to wire up the whole dependency graph, then we're good. And the truth of the matter is compilation solves that problem because we know the work ahead of time and we can optimize it. So that optimizes creation, and then the runtime takes over for updates. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. But all that being said, VDOMs can be very, very performant. When people come at me and be like, oh, yeah, of course, reactivity, VDOMs are, you know, just overhead, and they quote that article, I'm just like, there are VDOM libraries that are much faster than Svelte. Like, don't kid yourself there. Like, this distinction alone isn't going to determine whether your library is fast. It doesn't preclude non-VDOM libraries from being fast. Like, not only virtual DOM libraries are fast, but it's like if you took, I spent a lot of time benchmarking. If you just take all the libraries that are trying to be fast, and even anything from weekend projects, which I guess you can kind of dismiss, to bigger ones like Inferno.js, perfect example. Custom compiled JSX, different than the React JSX, incredible performance. You will be hard pressed to find a benchmark where Inferno is not right at the top, and that is a virtual DOM, and it can run circles around Svelte. So
there's more nuance to just no DOM or I mean no virtual DOM or virtual DOM.
Yeah, definitely. So I could go on forever on that topic.
No, it's great.
Just because it's misunderstood a lot, right?
So another difference for Solid is that you have this maybe we could say unique approach for hooks, right? They behave differently than in React.js, and I wanted to focus on that. If you could maybe talk a little bit about the difference.
Yeah, and to be fair, it's a difference that all reactive libraries actually benefit from, right? Hooks are kind of crazy when you think about it. Like, they somehow jammed this kind of primitive API on top of the top-down renderer, and it works. It mostly works and makes sense. But the truth of the matter is, Knockout.js, just go back to 2010, we had hook, right? They're not the same. Not at all, but we had that primitive thing, and it actually kind of made more sense, because the idea with reactive libraries is you run your code, your setup code or your component code, it runs once, and then you wire up all these events, and then those kind of event listeners, those kind of hooks, are what reruns, right? Like, and that is a very logical model. You're just like, okay. It's like hello world when you write a program. It just runs. You go, and then you set up some stuff. The React model, everything reruns over and over and over again. And the hooks are like a blacklisting or whitelisting system where you're like, this time when you rerun it, run this function, or this time when you rerun it, run this function. But it creates this kind of closure, kind of order thing where you kind of go like, okay, what's getting updated on this run versus this run based on what changed. Whereas the reactive model, which is true of Svelte, Vue, or whatnot, you just like, okay, these are the things that change. This is what runs. So I think it's a lot simpler.
So you don't have problems like...
It's not actually like any more that different from like a performance standpoint, at least on the surface. There's more details there, but I think that it feels more natural to me, and it's the reason why when hooks came out, you almost immediately saw the reactive people like raise their hand. Like Evan, he was like, okay, we're exposing our reactive system. I don't know why they didn't before. Maybe it was the same fear I was talking about. I didn't think anyone would like Solid before hooks were announced. Evan probably thought that he could never actually realistically expose it and people to like it. But Rich Harris, I love this tweet. On literally like the day after, you see him like realize Svelte 3 in the Twitter chat. He's like, I guess Svelte could have hooks. He writes it, and then like an hour later, he's like, screw that, we're compiler mofos, and he writes this basic JavaScript, and he's like, there we go, there's my hooks. And that it was just so obvious for people who've been working in the reactive space, even though strangely absent from the prior art on React hooks, was that these primitives looked a lot like reactive primitives, but the reactive primitives are sort of just better at it.
So with Solid.js, you don't have those problems that are associated with React.js, like rules of hooks, right?
Yeah, hook
or state closures.
With stale closures, no, you don't have any of that. But you have like different concerns, right? And you see this with that. Like the common one you see with reactive libraries is you can't destructure, so to speak. Is that where you access the data matters. So like with view setup functions, you have to kind of wrap the stuff leaving. In the case of Solid, where I use single function components, if you want to access some kind of proxy data, you got to do it inside the hook or in the JSX, right? And Svelte doesn't quite have that limitation because the way they use the compiler to magic everything, but still like variables declared and used within $signs still have limits. So like there's definitely, while it writes naturally, you can occasionally catch yourself if you're trying to access stuff where you're not supposed to access it. But I suppose a good linting rule could deal with that. I mean, React seemed to be fine with adding linting rules for the hook dependencies. So I mean, having a linting rule to say like, hey, you might be accessing this in a way that is not intended could probably achieve the same thing.
Interesting. So what's the story of server-side rendering for Solid.js?
This was a fun one because like honestly, front-end frameworks, I spent so much time, like I told you, years kind of working on perfecting what I considered the way a front-end framework could work. Server-side rendering was like the farthest from my mind. And I honestly didn't know the state of it. So I kind of went in and I tried some stuff, and everything I tried, I was like, oh, this is terrible. I thought I could just run the DOM, like I thought I could just like use JS DOM and do it. And then, I tried a couple libraries, one by Andrea Giamarchi back with like basic HTML, still not good enough. Recently, linked DOM has been created, which might actually change the equation a bit there. But generally speaking, I was just having the hardest time, and I had this reactive system. And then I looked at Svelte, and I looked at Marco, especially Marco, because Marco was like 6 times faster than every other library for rendering on the server. And I was like, oh, they're literally just concatenating strings, and they're just like dropping reactivity. We're just like pretending reactivity doesn't exist on the server. And once I figured out how that worked out, it wasn't actually that hard to just swap the runtime and slightly change the compiler. And in the end, I was able to kind of match Marco's raw rendering speed. I actually got it a little bit faster once someone from the community pointed out that I was using Svelte's actually escaping logic, and they're like, this is really slow. So I corrected it, and it was just like, so like,
wow, that's pretty impressive.
It just right out. And truth matters, I went back to the Svelte community and talked to them, and they'll be implementing that speed improvement there as well.
So maybe we could clarify, we could maybe step back a little bit, because you mentioned a few times Marco.js, and I discovered Marco.js a few years ago, and I was blown away by, I think it's very underappreciated project still, although it's getting more popular. And they're doing amazing stuff, and I know you are working now also on Marco.js.
Yeah, and that was the other side of the server rendering. I talk about like the raw performance stuff because it's easy. I can benchmark it. I can be like, fastest, Solid, 10 times faster than React, But that it doesn't matter. Like when we're talking about server rendering, unless we're talking about your cost of your bills, like how much CPU you're using, we're talking a matter of milliseconds or handfuls of milliseconds. It's not probably going to kill you. What Marco is so unique is they basically solved two of the biggest things that we're heading towards in frameworks and server-side rendering, and they solved it in 2014. Like they've been sitting on it for 7 years. That being progressive rendering and partial hydration. And
could you elaborate on those two for those who
progressive rendering is the ability to render to a stream as stuff comes in. Like I know React has render to node stream, but current React is not doing this. What I mean is like literally we can just render the stuff as it comes in. And in the case, they actually had even back in 2014 something called out of order flushing, which basically the server renders the placeholder, keeps on rendering the page, and as the async stuff comes in, continues to stream that content into the page and then insert it dynamically in where those placeholders have. So kind of like a server-side suspense was kind of what Marco came up with back in 2014 and released actually. And that's the kind of the whole secret. They can basically get the fastest first paint without blocking any of the assets, even having images and stuff load quicker, as the page loads. And then as they don't have to wait for the client to make the requests, all the requests are happening immediately on the server in a non-blocking way. And in the end, you basically get the page as if it was served without having to wait for anything, especially when you combine with the second feature, partial hydration. If the content that's coming in isn't interactive, well, there's no hydration cost on the end. So pages just load lightning fast. I mean, there's a trade-off. Marco was designed for multi-page apps primarily. You can use it for single page, but generally the benefit comes from it's very hard to split off any code that happens to be below a decision point in the client. So if you have the router is almost at the top, which means you almost have to include all the client code. With Marco, with multi-page app, the router is on the server, which means that you don't have to include almost any of the client code, which means that like you more or less, like if you have a page that has no JavaScript, well, there's no JavaScript. And if you have a page where, there's a couple little islands, they don't ship all the components. So depending on the type of site you want, sure, it's not a single page app, but depending, content sites, e-commerce stuff, this is like a no-brainer. It's super, super, super performant. And it scales well with slow networks, something that like Jamstack doesn't necessarily do. Obviously static site generation works the best at all times, but sometimes you don't have all the data available for you. So when you're doing dynamic rendering, you have to really, consider that.
So what's the relation? I mean, moving forward, is there any convergence between those two projects? How Solid and Marco? How do you see the future?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm super stoked to work on Marco because they're so far ahead of their time on the server side. But on the other hand, the client side, and the same reason why people probably never picked it up, they just kind of look at it and they're like, meh, okay performance, does its thing. But the thing is, the guys on the Marco team, very smart, very into the guts of this stuff. They saw the work that I was doing with Solid, and they were like, you could tell that this sort of completed the loop. They knew that they wanted to improve partial hydration even further, right? Like in Marco, partial hydration is automatic. End user doesn't have to do anything. There's no server components. It automatically figures it out. But they're like, yeah, we can do better. We can do better than server components. And they saw the work I was doing on the granularity and reactivity, and they realized if they put the two things together, we could basically slice the stuff down to such a small granularity that we could ship way less code, reduce the runtime execution, shrink everything down. And in that sense, that's kind of the direction for Marco. Marco is a language like Svelte, and that makes it have its own sort of philosophy and approach. And we're taking that to the extreme. Like there's a lot of benefits to that, and I've written about it, but it's kind of incredible where that's heading. Solid, on the other hand, has all the things I personally like. I like React. Most people who use reactive libraries are like, I don't like React. No, I love React. I like control. I like getting down to that detail. And for me, Solid represents like the philosophy of React in the way that I want to see it done, with the extreme performance, extreme control. So working on both projects for me just makes a lot of sense, because while I've learned a lot about server rendering, which I'm applying where I can to to Solid. It probably will never be as good at server rendering as Marco. It's just harder. Everything in the language is built with server rendering in mind. I don't think most frameworks would have a hard time matching the kind of static compiler analysis. Marco's compiler analysis goes across files. It's kind of crazy. Whereas, on the flip side, a lot of the granular stuff is going to really help Marco in performance in the future. And while I see this convergence between single page apps and multi-page apps, you see stuff like Livewire from Rails and, different kind of streaming technologies with the new React server components. What I'm really anticipating, like I think ultimately the thing that stays the same, even as these things converge, is that people have a certain comfort level and certain people have certain kind of philosophy between, kind of preference behind what they want to build. And to me, that means like for front-end developers, there's two types of developers who like Svelte and developers who like React. And for me, Solid is for the developers who like React, and Marco is for the developers who like Svelte. That's pretty much the simple thing. I don't know, who wins that battle. I don't know ultimately, but if you want easy language, just HTML or whatever, that's Marco. If you're like I control freak, I want the power of JavaScript. I mean, in a lot of ways, mechanically, things aren't that different, but there's subtle differences. And I like taking each approach to the extreme to really, showcase what you can do there, because they can both bring unique things to the table.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And when I asked some questions to my community, they asked me if they should invest into Solid. Is there a risk getting into that, given that React is so popular, even though Solid seems so much better?
I mean, we all start somewhere. It's a tricky one, right? A single maintainer kind of thing. I've been expanding out the core team. I have a couple guys now that have been working with us that are, really, really strong at there's specific areas to help grow out this team. I have one, David, who's working on the community, and he's good, kind of marketing and assets and design. And then I have another guy who's been doing all the integration tools. You might have seen him tweet stuff about Vite or Vite, however you say it, and Snowpack. He's been crazy, made the REPL. So like the team's growing beyond just me. But with any of these things, it's always hard when if the founder moves on or something. I have no intention to, but I've been a senior dev on projects. I've been a tech lead. I understand the choice of making the technology. In 2018, when I made the technology choice, I did not go with Solid. I went with Preact and ultimately React for our redesign of that knockout app. So I understand. I'd like to think that if it was 2020, I might make a different decision, but Solid is not 1.0 right now. I'm not going to lie to anyone. I want to be realistic here. But on the other hand, I put a lot of work into this, and I think what we've learned here is real. And I think that it will continue to have an impact. And it's possible that the current crop of frameworks will not implement this approach ever. So I think it does have a unique space, and I'm going to continue to push it as much as I can.
So what would be the maybe 2 or 3 things missing, like a major things you want to develop? In the near future in Solid.js?
Yeah, definitely. One of the biggest things, most definitely, is I want a story around debugging. I've been having, in some ways, it's really easy if you know HTML and JavaScript, because solid templates kind of like literally compile and spill it out in front of you. Like I used to hate debugging JSX. Like you get into the tree and you'd be like, God, which children am I in? That kind of thing. At least on the DOM updates and stuff, it's really easy to see like you literally see the DOM calls like right in your code. But on the flip side, any declarative library, especially one like Solid where components don't re-render, which is actually very unique. That's probably the most unique thing about Solid is components don't re-render. It's like takes reactivity to the extreme in that sense, like fine grain. It's sometimes hard to kind of mentally follow where the updates are happening. So I want to improve visualization, but it makes it hard because like most debug tools are like, here's your component tree. Solid, there's no components. That's why it's performant, but also why this is tricky. So that's an area that I want to see developed out. Second
Do
one,
you have any like a vision for how would you present that? How would you visualize that? This kind of debugging for
it's a tricky one, right? Because it's like somewhere between Redux dev tools with all the like the data nodes and Cycle.js's marble diagrams, or ArcGIS's marble diagrams. Like it's really somewhere in between that, and that's a tricky problem. We have a couple of guys, in the Discord community who are kind of like looking at that and trying to like figure out wrapping their heads around how we can do this, because there is a graph there. There's actually two kind of graphs. There's a dependency graph for the reactive system, and then there's an ownership graph for like how that reactive system's owned, but there isn't really components per se. So neither of those translate necessarily to how the end user views their own program. So mapping that and coming up with a way of doing that is definitely a challenge. So yeah, I'm hoping just a bunch of like little nodes and circles and lines and data visualization type stuff. Xstate's another library that has good data visualization. Maybe I can figure out how to borrow some of those aspects, because that's really the challenge with the granular stuff. It's that like there really is no components.
Interesting.
And then HMR, similar problem. I managed to do a similar thing, but I'd love to be able to keep state. It's just a hard problem for these kind of libraries. I thought, honestly, if you asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said server-side rendering and hydration would be a really hard problem, but I did manage to figure those out. So, and even figure out how to do the same kind of progressive rendering that Marco does. So, I would like to improve that a bit in the future, but I'd say the third thing is it needs to be easier to start with Solid. Right now we have a CRA fork that kind of sucks and is dated, and CRA is difficult, unwieldy, and doesn't have a good server-side story. So I've been working on Vite, or Vite. I never know how to say that.
I wanted to ask you about that, about Vite and Snowpack. I mean, in general, what do you think about those two similar approaches and how they fit with Solid?
I have to thank Alex again for this, the other guy, the guy who's been doing all the integration work. He's been doing a lot of the legwork in looking into it. I mean, I did look into Snowpack myself, and then I kind of got stuck on the server side. It just didn't make sense the way I was thinking of doing things. And then Alex showed me and I was just like, oh wow, this is it, right? Like, and things went really quick. So we were able to put together that Hacker News demo, showcase off our progressive rendering, TypeScript, small size. And then I was like, okay, cherry on top, we have to showcase how this all comes together. So deployed it to Cloudflare, because that's the only edge worker that supports progressive render, and spun up the whole demo to just kind of show it, showcase like. And really, it's while the example is really simple, so it's kind of an understatement. The indications of like performance and the way it works is really quite powerful. It really showcases off Solid speed. I don't think there's a faster like dynamics or generated Hacker News out there right now. But that being said, that is not a starter that people can just dive into. So now I have to do the actual hard work of actually generalizing this and making that, and that is on my roadmap, and that's what I want to say. I don't know if I'd go as far as SvelteKit, but we need a starter that can make getting started with server rendering really easy, and basically like our own kind of version of SvelteKit. And I've started work on that. That's probably the last of the three things. I think HMR, hot module reloading, is good enough for now. I think that debug story and this kind of starter are really my last pieces I want to put in place for 1.0. I mean, during the process, I get to kind of ensure that the APIs are stable, but I think Solid's actually in a reasonably stable place to, for people serious about to start looking into it.
And do you see any room for something like Next.js for Solid.js? So this kind of like a framework or like a convention.
That was the thing people were asking me, and maybe, but the thing is, like, Next itself is not going to support Solid. We're different enough than React. Like, it's just not going to be like a plugin. And people started on those projects, and then when Vite came out and Snowpack, they're kind of like, what am I supposed to do? And I think this is a sign of a kind of change. I mean, Svelte and Rich saw this almost immediately, and obviously Evan, because he's developing this, is that maybe like there will be these frameworks built on top of these tools, and they'll be opinionated. But I think that's for someone else to figure out. I think we can actually get for the average user, something pretty powerful right out of the box that just ships with the framework, like just because of how good these like Vite or Snowpack are. Like I think that while there's probably still a place for Next.js, I wonder that because of how easy it is to get that base config, if Next.js is just gonna be a dime a dozen, right? Like is everyone just gonna make like a billion Next.jses? Like Vercel's value is in more than just the Next.js framework. It's in the deployment architecture. They've got the whole story. Next itself, I don't know. I'm sure it'll still continue to do well because it has all the power behind it, but it's getting easier and easier to kind of put these systems together.
Yeah. Interesting. Would you mind if we focus on some questions from the community?
So
there's one from Nicola. Let me display it. How much of React.js limitations are due to it being renderer agnostic versus other libs who only render DOMs?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting one. Like the native part is interesting because like compilers is sort of my answer here, because the problem is the other frameworks that are like so I'm going to dance around a bit. If you're talking Preact, then I would say yes, Preact's able to streamline stuff because they're not as render agnostic. But on the compiler side, you just kind of sidestep this. You go like, if I'm going to target that platform, I'm going to use a compiler for it, right? Which is what I've experienced with Marco, Solid to a certain degree, and with Svelte. I think that components are still components. That part isn't really the restriction. It's more of like React doesn't get to optimize the DOM operations in the same sort of way that I can, or Svelte can, or Marco can. But it's not because of the render agnostic. It's just because it's like it's always a VDOM. Like it doesn't get to change. Like it doesn't get to change how it compiles. Like they're just not. It's not set up that way, right? I've seen someone actually made, not with Solid, but with a Surplus, a kind of similar reactive library that's a few years older. Someone made a native script wrapper. So they were doing like React Native style development with that. I haven't explored that with Solid yet, but someone was working on Pixie. Like you can kind of skip the DOM updates and just use the reactive component model to kind of make alternative renders. I remember I was helping someone debug an app, and I can't go into very much detail because it's obviously it's closed source, but essentially there was no DOM elements in this whole app. It was like there's one canvas, and they basically constructed using context and components a whole renderer that rendered to canvas. So like I think maybe making it exposable to the end community might make it have more restrictions, but like there's other ways around that. So I don't know. I think it's more of just the nature of the generic approach that React takes instead of being the specific approach. It makes it easier, definitely. You don't like have to write a custom compiler for it. But then again, if you're wrapping stuff with components, you don't really need to either.
So there is another a comment about Svelte React suffering areas, physical based animations.
Maybe be more specific, because I mean,
what's the story for animations in Solid.js? Is it like easy?
It's not like, I consider Svelte one of the better stories for animation. That's why it's kind of interesting here. They're not granular, so they don't get to quite like win the like 60 frames per second scenario, but generally speaking, transitions and everything, like anything to handle the flow of the app, Svelte is amazing. Solid, like the reason is Svelte compiles their components into a series of life cycles. Like you write your code, and then they end up with these classes that have like all the life cycles kind of code split out, and they split your code and insert it into the right life cycles, and it just handles everything kind of automatically, and it's built into the framework. Whereas in something like Solid, I don't have the same like the same control, because the whole DOM's a side effect. So I actually handle the animations the same way like Vue or React does. You wrap it in a transition group. Maybe someone will write better libraries in the future, but it's just not as built in, because like the components aren't real. It's kind of just like a construct we'd have to make. Yeah, I'm not terribly familiar with the native stuff. My only native programming experience is React Native, so I can't really speak too much on that. It's just not an area that I have expertise in.
No worries. So maybe because we are already 1 hour, and I was thinking maybe you could teach me some Solid.js, like a quick demo or something of that sort. If that's okay for you.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe we could focus on just one thing, and let me just change my screen. Yeah, so I have this. I'm not sure if it's visible.
Yeah.
I have this counter, and there are a few interesting things that are happening here. So the first one, I can create state as an object, nested object. So what's nice, I can, for example, nest it even further.
Yeah.
Right. And then I can use something like cursor.
Yeah, I can see the TypeScript complaining at you. I was actually playing with this earlier because to answer the question of whether how good the autocomplete worked. And the truth of the matter is the typing works, but sometimes I think the autocomplete is ambiguous. So unless it knows the return type, it can't always complete as nicely along the path. Although if you tried to write in a different value right now, like if you tried to call it something, it's going to
have an error. Yeah.
Right. So
and it says I should use a value. Yeah.
So my experience is that the autocomplete works good at 1 level depth. At 2 level depth, I can make it work, but like it's not happening the natural way that I'd be programming. I have to like put the value in first before I start typing in. Like I have to put the third argument in before I put in the second argument, and yeah, it's kind of a mess. Anyways, but generally speaking, yeah, the typing for the set state is good.
And I was thinking maybe you could show me some tricks or things that you find interesting, or maybe are, lesser known things about Solid.js.
Yeah. I mean, the counter example, there's only so far I can take it. I mean, I did watch the intro video that you did, where I thought it was interesting that you did the binding syntax. This binding syntax is a thing, but it's usually, people don't always use it. It's more for event delegation. Like if you have a for,
it shouldn't be used.
Yeah, it's basically an optimization more than anything. But I mean, let me think of what is cool. Actually, that demo that I put together a little while ago might be the most visual difference for people still struggling with the difference between React and Solid.
Let me just quickly.
If you have the link to that still, or do you want me? That, because like the basic experience with using Solid is very similar to like React, like that. You just kind of, I mean, create signal is probably the most primary thing that's almost like use state, but it's essentially just declare some state, put some stuff in the view. It's pretty straightforward. But like, I think that what makes it really click on the difference is that Solid runs the components once. So it only ever reevaluates the hooks, so to speak, or the individual JSX bindings. So that means, there's some considerations there. But it also, makes, you can start to understand why the performance is so powerful, right? Because if you look at this code sandbox here that I shared before, if you look at this code and think of it as React code or something, you kind of go, okay, we've got a parent component A that's got some state, right? It's created a signal, I call it, and then it's going to, in our case, signals are functions, just because we have to track the getters. That's just how reactive libraries work. It's either going to be a function or it's going to be like a dot value, like Svelte. I just thought the function gives us some benefits over dot value if you're willing to give up assignment, which, given my strict, React philosophy kind of approach, is perfectly valid. You can see here, when we pass it to B, we kind of do a transformation. We add 1 to the value, and then in C, or in B, when we pass the C, I remove the thing. I'm just showing like basic data transformation going on. This basically cancels it out by the time you actually get down to C. But I just wanted to show kind of how we started with this thing. And, you know, as you can see, you click the button and it still just isn't our same counter from before, basically like the other example. But what's interesting here is, do you expect those console logs to fire, right? If it's React, the answer is yes. In fact, if it's most things, the answer is yes. But in Solid, basically, the components only run once. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's that ABC, and it never happens again. When you click that button, what's actually happening is the final the click handler that you pass through. You know, that part is pretty straightforward. Calls the set value function, right? And that updates that one signal, but that doesn't mean A doesn't need to reevaluate. What actually ends up happening is each of those values that we pass through are individually wrapped. So in a function. So when we set value, it basically tells this whole stream. It's almost like a stream running through here of value changes all the way down to this direct binding. It's actually only this direct binding in here which updates the inside of that text that actually ever reruns. Like the function, if we could intercept in here this function in where the values are passed, you'll see those rerun, but the component itself doesn't. It's basically like we created a stream straight through the components from that initial state all the way down to where it's inserted. Right. Yeah. So like if I did console log in there, that will run for sure. And even if you console log inside the value equals, that will run. But basically, we've isolated all the props into their own channels, essentially. Mm-hmm. So because everything's based off lazy evaluation, it's the only like effect that is actually in this whole equation is the effect wrapping the DOM insert in component C. That's really kind of the power here, is that we can do pinpoint updates even through props, right? Like there's you don't have to do any of the unnecessary diffing work.
I think it's a good thing maybe to finish on. Ryan, I would like to thank you for this amazing interview. I learned a lot. I hope the viewers did too, and maybe we will have a chance to speak again and to focus maybe on some specific things, because we covered a lot of things, and yeah,
I like to talk.
It was amazing, extremely interesting. Thank you for being here.
And thank you for
us about Solid.js. Good luck with the project, and
no, for sure.
Again.
Thank you so much. I haven't had a chance to talk about this as much as I would have liked, so the opportunity I appreciate very much. I'd love to come back sometime.
With pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the listeners, and see you in the next one.
Bye.